All right, so everybody's just got to accept that, and then we can move right ahead. Okay.
Okay.
All right, the show is all yours, Tom.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. I was in Marquette. I don't know if you, Charlie, were you at that presentation that I did in Marquette a couple of years ago?
I don't think so, no.
Okay, I very much enjoyed it, but anyway, that was, excuse me. That was our second book, my bad. I've been writing and having these books published by Mission Point Press for about 5 years now. That's Blood on the Mitten was my first, and Dark Side of the Mitten came out late last year. I got into writing about crime. I was a reporter. I worked in Sault Ste. Marie for a couple of years. I worked in Traverse City for about 20 years, and then I went on my own and I did some stuff for public radio as well as freelancing until I got into doing books. Now, the one case in all of my books that probably I have the most personal connection with, I guess, not probably without a doubt, is the one in the first book, and it's a chapter that would be titled A Convenient Confession, and that was about a case that I covered for about 17 years in different media around Traverse City. In 1996, a woman was murdered in her home. She was put in the trunk of her car and left in there in a shut up garage while the car ran, and she died of asphyxiation. Excuse me. DNA evidence, however, on the scene. Well, anyway, there was a long DNA dispute and they had the wrong guy in jail for about 17 years until finally a judge said, hey, you need to put that DNA on the nationwide DNA database. And in no time, they got the criminal. They got they got the actual killer. Now, I want to talk about some of the worst people in Michigan, so I might as well start with the most prolific serial killer. And I'm going to kind of go through different things from different books of mine, but I will let you kind of know when I'm doing something from the new book. I'm kind of mixing them all in here. But this is John Norman Collins, and he was terrorizing Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti by killing young women back in the late 60s, early 70s, and about 1969. And that's probably the serial killer that most people think of when they think of Michigan. He killed 7 young women in Michigan, and well, 6 in Michigan, 1 in California. Michigan's actually most prolific serial killer was at the turn of the 20th century, and her name was Mary McKnight. And I'm sorry about the noise going through here. We have a detour going down our road, so State Highway is kind of going by, and we have our windows open. Anyway, Mary McKnight, she killed her victims with strychnine by putting it in their food or medicine, and she killed, officially, they said 12 people, but some people believe it might have been as high as 18. The stones that you see up on the upper left, the headstones, those are of her final victims, but it's only 2 of the 3 of her final victims that are identified there. John Murphy, her brother, his wife Gertrude Murphy, and their baby, their daughter, very young daughter. She also was poisoned and died by Mary McKnight, and she is buried in her mother's arms. But they had to be dug up when people started to wonder about their deaths. And this kind of cracked the entire case. So they exhumed the bodies, sent the contents of their stomachs back in 1903 down to laboratories in Ann Arbor, and they came back, said they had strychnine in their stomachs. Mary McKnight. That was the end of her murdering spree, which lasted several years and got very little notice because a lot of people thought that her victims might have died of natural causes until she was finally caught. Now, the worst mass murderer in Michigan is also the worst school massacre. The perpetrator of the worst school massacre in the history of the United States, and his name was Andrew Kehoe. And that was in Bath, Michigan, back in the same week that Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic in his history-making flight, solo flight. That very week, Andrew Kehoe, who was ticked off about a lot of things. He had been a former school board member. He had opposed the building of a new school. He had, people thought that he was wiring the school for electricity to be a nice guy, but his bitterness just seethed in him, and he was actually putting TNT and other explosives into the nooks and crannies of the basement of the school until on the morning of May 18th, he blew up the entire school. 45 people killed, most of them children. Bath is about 10 miles north, mostly north, and a little bit west of Lansing. They heard the blast in Lansing. Now, that might not be the most prolific mass murder, actually the largest mass murder in Michigan history, if you categorize the Italian Hall disaster in Calumet in 1913, if you categorize that as a murder, because there's indications that it may have been done maliciously. Had the person yelled fire, if you're familiar with the story, I assume, in Calumet, had the person at the children's Christmas party yelled fire, had he known that 73 people, mostly children, were going to die by tumbling down those stairs and being crushed? I don't know, but I mean, there's a good case to say that that's the worst mass murder in Michigan history. Of course, here is a funeral scene. It was just a vast, mournful thing to happen, particularly around Christmas. Now, Michigan's folklore also includes, I mean, not folklore, Michigan's historical history of true crime also includes pirates, particularly a guy by the name of Dan Seavey, who operated out of Escanaba. He stole timber and sold it on the black markets down in Chicago. He got illegally poached venison, sold it down in Chicago, knew all the people that were going to buy this stuff, kidnapped pioneer women on occasion, sold them on the black market down in Chicago as sex slaves. Pretty nasty guy. He didn't have an eye patch or a peg leg or a sword, but he was nonetheless a pirate. He did, however, on one occasion, put a cannon on the deck of his boat and shot a hole in a rival's boat who was pouring in on his illegal venison trade and sunk the boat, crew, captain, and all. They all drowned. And then when he finally was caught by the federal government, he retired from his life of crime and acted as and helped them to catch other Great Lakes pirates. Dark Side of the Mitten, my latest book, I want to highlight just kind of how that's a little bit different from some of the ones I do. I do have fair amount of murder. I have 42 stories in there. I have a bunch of murders. I have also some less than flattering information stories about some of the people whose names are immortal in Michigan. Like the guy on the right here is Henry Ford. Definitely changed the world and put the world on wheels. That guy on his left is Harry Bennett, his right-hand man, his confidant, and also his muscle. Harry had been close to the mob. He had mob ties. He was the muscle when people were trying to unionize. He'd get a bunch of bouncers together, I guess you'd call them, and turn a protest into kind of a head bashing. The guy who, but Henry Ford, of course, also was quite anti-Semitic. He even had bought a newspaper to write about it and put the copies of it in his showrooms around the state, and even received citations from the Third Reich for the influence of his writings. And he only did it for a few years until he got sued, but it's been kind of a stain on him, his legacy. Antoine Cadillac, the Frenchman who discovered Detroit. He gave brandy to the Native Americans, got them, a lot of them quite hooked on it, and used it to his advantage to get valuable furs from them, and made himself quite a fortune. While he was commander of Fort Detroit, or Fort Pontchartrain at that time, he locked up the brandy, also incurring the wrath of his Frenchmen. There were a lot of other things about him that ticked a lot of people off, but there's also even Chief Pontiac. He was so paranoid about, and had for good reason, about the European illnesses that had come with people, with the Europeans that were settling, that when he was in Detroit and trying to band together all these different tribes, he acted quite heroically. However, this one girl, who was a British girl, who was a prisoner of theirs, she had dysentery. He had every reason to be very nervous about that, again, because of the way people's diseases had really devastated the Native American populations in both North and South America by that time. But he took the girl and he threw her in the Maumee River and asked the Frenchmen to drown her. The Frenchmen did. The British in Detroit were going to try them both, but they decided, well, it never came to be. Now, this is William Beaumont on the right, and looks like he might be sewing up this patient. The patient's name is Alexis St. Martin. He's not sewing him up, though. Alexis St. Martin got shot at a trading post on Mackinac Island. He was accidentally shot below the chest. It pierced him and made a hole in there, which healed not in a normal way. The inside healed with the outside, but they didn't heal together to close the hole. So therefore, he had sort of an accidental orifice for the rest of his life. When William Beaumont, who is the namesake of an entire system of hospitals in the Detroit area, based in Royal Oak, when William Beaumont, an Army doctor, saw this, he asked if he could do some experiments, and he tied food, first meat and vegetable. Well, he went on to do all kinds of different food, but he tied them to a string, dropped it into Alexis's hole, right into his stomach, and then pulled it out and observed that acid had been eating away at this. He discovered the stomach acids that help us to digest. It was really groundbreaking work, and he deserves his fame. However, it's strange that there are no, as far as I know, no wings named for Alexis St. Martin, without whom it's arguable that William Beaumont may have never been a groundbreaking physician. He conducted these experiments on this unusual wound for years. He realized how valuable this situation was for him, and so he took advantage of Alexis St. Martin's illiteracy and got him to agree to basically sign on as an indentured servant who let him not only do these medical tests, but, chop firewood and whatever that he needed him to do. And so William Beaumont, pictured here, he went on to quite a bit of renown within his profession. And Alexis St. Martin, the man who received the Hall as when he was a fur trader on Mackinac Island. Finally, he stood up to William Beaumont, broke it off, went back to Quebec, where he was from, and William Beaumont passed away. Yet Alexis St. Martin was still getting letters from doctors all around the world wanting to run tests on him and study him. And he said, "I've had enough of this. No way." When he died, his family in Quebec left his body for several days out in the August sun in a field where crows could pick at it and the sun could do its thing to break it down, so that by the time they went back and buried it, it would be in no condition for somebody to work on it, because Alexis said, "I don't even want him to be, just let me rest in peace." He didn't want to be poked and prodded ever again. Michigan also has a history in slavery. Now, we don't think of it so much as except for that Detroit and Port Huron were important stops along and other points between there in Michigan were important stops along the Underground Railroad. But also at one time, slavery was legal in Michigan, because it was legal before it became illegal. And became illegal through the Northwest Ordinance back in 17, if I remember correct, back in the 1780s. I don't want to say an exact date because I might be wrong here, but anyway, so that made slavery illegal, but still the British were kind of ruling the roost in southeastern Michigan, and so they kind of let it slide. It had already existed. And some of the big names that we know of throughout Michigan, there's names like Lewis Cass. He was a territorial governor. He went on to be on presidential cabinets, to be a major presidential candidate. He owned slaves. Drive down Woodward Avenue and you think, this, I don't know who the guy who this was named after, but he must have been important. He was the guy, he was a judge. He was assigned by Thomas Jefferson. He helped lay out the roads in Detroit, and he based them on the way they were done in Paris. And little, I guess, surprise that he would name the main artery after himself. But that's where Woodward Avenue came from. This is Augustus Woodward, and he was known to have bad hygiene. And he was, although he made some rulings favorable to escaped slaves up in Michigan. However, he owned a Native American man as a slave for his entire time here. And there were also some heroics. This is a man by the name of Adam Crosswhite, and he and his wife were slaves, as well as his children were slaves down in Kentucky. They escaped from Kentucky. They were living in Marshall. There were some other escaped slaves, but also they're surrounded by people who were friendly to them. And when a posse came up from Kentucky to kidnap them and take them back into slavery, about 150 people from in the city of Marshall surrounded the house and allowed the family to escape. They rode through the night in a covered wagon for a couple of nights, got into Detroit, went through to Windsor, and eventually returned back to Marshall after the Civil War. We don't think too much also of, we don't hear a lot about the expulsion of the Indians from Michigan, but I do go into some of that in Darks of the Mitten. This is Chief Pokagon. He was a Potawatomi Indian down in southwestern Michigan. The Potawatomi, I don't know a lot about how some of the other tribes were, like the Ojibwa and the Ottawa, who are predominant up in the UP and in northern lower Michigan. But the Potawatomi were in the Saginaw Valley, and they were under President Andrew Jackson when he was had people commanding the Cherokee removal down south, known as the Trail of Tears. The Potawatomi people were rounded up and marched out of Michigan, out of Ohio, out of Indiana and Illinois, and across to the other side of the Mississippi as well. That was called the Trail of Death. It was nowhere near as large in numbers, but it was still there was a lot of death and misery along the way. And now Michigan, I want to talk about gangsters for a while. And I'm not going to talk about the Purple Gang tonight, but this is Babyface Nelson, who, by the way, you did not want to call him Babyface to his face. But he was not from Michigan, but he's significant in that in 1933 in Grand Haven on the Lake Michigan shore, his first time that he led a bank robbery was in Grand Haven. He didn't organize it very well, and he didn't get a very good getaway driver, because a getaway driver got spooked and fled. They hijacked a car at a light. They got a few miles out of town, ran out of gas, bought another car, hopped in it, went a little ways, got a flat tire. It took them 3 cars to get down to the Indiana border. Anyway, John Dillinger also. Now he has a couple of ties with Michigan. Up in the western UP, I know that my in-laws in Bessemer have took me to see the place where there was a big shootout in northern Wisconsin, not far from the Michigan state line. Well, after that, he came in and he stayed in Sault Ste. Marie for a few days, where a woman that he knew was staying and then it was not only a couple of months before he was killed. Another John Dillinger story that ends in Michigan, however, involves a different person here, and it involves John Dillinger's most infamous bank robbery. His most infamous jailbreak. And that was in Crown Point, Indiana. And he was breaking out of jail. And mind you, I'll get to the Michigan part. The story ends in Michigan. This is Herbert Youngblood. And when John Dillinger got out of there are two different versions of the story. He either whittled a gun, coated it in shoe polish. Whittled a gun out of soap or wood, covered it in shoe polish, and pointed it at a guard who opened the cell and let him out. The other version is he just said, "What's your price to get me out of here?" and just paid him. But either way, when the door was open, he said, "Who's with me getting out of here? Who wants to help me get out of here?" Herbert Youngblood was the only one who said yes. He was probably going to be executed. He shot a grocery store owner when he was robbing up in Gary, Indiana, when he was robbing the grocery store, a poker game in the back of the grocery store. He picked up a toilet plunger to intimidate anybody who came near him. They got to where they kept the guns. They got a car from the garage. They got out. They got to Chicago. John Dillinger gave him $100. Herbert Youngblood took it, fled back to Port Huron. He hopped a train back into Michigan, ended up in Port Huron on the south side of the town, which was mostly black, and he figured he would just, it was industrial area. He figured that he would just blend in, but he didn't do what he needed to blend in because he was drunk most of the time, and he had bragged about knowing John Dillinger and about having broken out of jail. He ended up stealing some cigarettes from this store here, who had who was being run that day by the teenage son of the owner. Now, he came in, took some cigarettes. The boy said, "Pay for those." He said no. He lit them up, stood there being belligerent. The teenager called the cops. Cops came, patted him down, found he had one small pistol with him. And well, they got one and they missed one. He pulled it. There was a shootout. All three of the police officers were shot, but only one was fatal. The teenage son dove for one of the dropped guns and shot Herbert Youngblood several times. He died and said that he was asked for a Catholic priest. The Catholic priest said, confess your sins, lead us to where John Dillinger is. He gave them, and then you'll go to heaven. He gave them false information. So did not want to die a rat. Now, these guys, if you go to Charlevoix, you'll see the name Loeb here and there. And I won't go into too much of this. This one is in my latest book, Dark Side of the Mitten. And you'll see the Loeb name in Charlevoix. There was a castle. There was a mansion that looked like a castle. It was called Castle Farms. It's now a wedding and meeting venue. And one time I saw Aerosmith play there back in the early 90s. They were, but anyway, and there's a Loeb Road. You'll see other things, the name around in places. He used to spend his entire summer up there. His father was very influential. His father was very, he's the man in the middle here. His father was in Sears Roebuck, one of the main guys there. And so it was, of course, the Amazon of the day. He and Leopold, the guy on the left on the photo, Leopold and Loeb kidnapped a kid in Chicago when they were in the University of Chicago. They murdered him just because they thought they could get away with it, because they thought they were a superior bloodline and intellect of anybody else. And so, but they were convicted because Loeb had dropped some glasses there. And the cops took him around to some optometrists and found who they belonged to. Now, the reason why I talk about this is not only do they have the Charlevoix connection where the family was well thought of and such, but also the Richard Loeb was the youngest at the time person to ever be admitted into University of Michigan. Now, on the western end of the UP, there's a historical marker that says that on Lake Gogebic, beautiful Lake Gogebic, and it says that this is where the last stagecoach robbery east of the Mississippi occurred. Now, I don't know how you actually can figure something like that out, but it's actually more interesting than that. The guy in the upper corner there is Raymond Holsey, and he's the perpetrator. He was a guy who liked to be called Black Bart. He wasn't as successful as Black Bart, who was out in California holding up Wells Fargo wagons and wealthy people and such. Raymond Holsey was out on the trails in Michigan and Wisconsin, kind of at the border there, waiting for anybody who came by, and it would rob them whatever they got. He got $1 a couple of times. from people. But his fascination with Black Bart was born by his fascination of dime novels. When he did the last stagecoach robbery over there on Lake Gogebic, he came out of the woods, and there were three gentlemen who had been at a resort for the summertime, and they were from Milwaukee and Chicago and Montreal, I believe, and they were heading to a railroad station up in Bessemer to go back to their homes. Now, they were in a stagecoach. Out came Raymond Halsey. In the confusion that happened there, he happened to shoot one of them in the hip. The man fell off. They got him into a wagon. They took him 30 miles into, he got about $40 and a watch, I think, and ran into the woods. On the 30 miles of bumpy, rocky ride between Lake Gogebic and Bessemer to a hospital, the man bled to death. So now he was a murderer. So after running through the western UP there for a few days, and he came out into the town of Republic, and he got a room, and people were just kind of eyeballing him, and they figured that he met the description of the guy that they've been hearing about on the telegraph, that was talking about the guy who killed the businessman. Well, they ended up arresting him. He cried. He went into trial. They and all the newspapers talked about the 100 or so dime novels that were found in his permanent residence. And it was almost like attacking heavy metal music or video games these days. There were all these the papers, as far away as St. Louis at least, they had comments about how these dime novels are causing people to go to crime. But he said it was a head injury. He volunteered for an ancient operation, already kind of iffy towards a lot of medical people, but it was called trepanning. They cut out a disc out of your skull to supposedly relieve the pressure. They fold the skin back in and sew it back up. And he volunteered for that. And he lived, he was for decades after that. Oh, he was released from prison by Governor Chase Osborne, who was told that he was a model prisoner after his trepanning. And so he was a photographer, a wildlife photographer, and a hunting and fishing guide in Marquette for a long time thereafter. Now, if you go to Seney, the little town east of Munising, I'm sure you know, there's a Boot Hill Cemetery from the lumber days. And I had to look for it. I don't know if you've ever been there, but I had to ask around and find it. It's somewhere south of town there. And there's a whole bunch of unmarked, other than little crosses that I'm sure people must be keeping up with, because they'd be totally nothing but now. But anyway, so all the graves are concave like that. They're little troughs because these were indigent lumberjacks who were put in there after an accident, after God knows what, any other kind of death. But they just, if they didn't have anybody to claim them or anybody to send them to, they just ended up in a hole, and and they just caved in because there were no vaults, no, not even coffins there. And that kind of little gruesomeness kind of highlights just the lumber era, which is totally fascinating, and which, with all those guys coming from all over to work in the lumbering industry, and there was also a call for, comfort women. In fact, Michigan and Wisconsin were seen as were kind of a cause celeb back in the 1870s. There were stories in the national press about Michigan and Wisconsin lumber areas, lumber boom regions, and the brothels that are there. And they were full of stories like a woman by the name of Minnie Pine, who came from upstate New York to Chicago, was working for a restaurant, got talked into going up to not Copper Harbor, up to Crystal Falls, Michigan, and it was a trick. She was tricked into working in the brothel. And there was all these stories about despair and addictions and suicides and beatings and a lot of this was very true, but there were some people who didn't believe. They thought, well, these women are willing. Of course, the truth lies somewhere in between. There were some women who were willing. There were quite a few who were tricked into it with false advertising. And the governors of both Michigan, it was Governor Luce at the time, who was Luce County was named after him, Cyrus Luce, and a governor in Wisconsin, they both had independent studies done of this problem because it was getting so much press. They came to the conclusions that, well, Luce was kind of like, there's not really much happening there. The governor of Wisconsin was kind of like, well, they're pretty much they're pretty much all willing. And but there was a woman by the name of Catherine Bushnell, and she did her own study, and she did quite a scholarly study. She talked to about 200 people, like 200, most of them women, and she talked to them and interviewed them more than one time, and some of them, and wrote quite the paper. Now, some people thought she painted quite a grim picture of the whole industry. Some people thought she was being, too sensational about it. And this is in the latest book, Dark Side of the Mitten. There was a guy, when I was working in newspapers, this would have gotten me fired. But there was a guy at the Milwaukee Daily Journal, rather, who attacked her not for her findings, but for her looks. He says the piece irrelevantly described her as not what one would call an artist's dream, unless the artist had lunched on mince pie and pickles before going to sleep on a rail pile. Now, I guess that was some kind of sick burn back in the 1800s. But anyway, that was kind of the attitude towards of many of the men in power towards this. But it was quite the problem. And back in Clare, Michigan, which was for a while kind of the epicenter when it was booming in the 1880s, there were no fewer than 21 brothels in the county. There were such huge lumber camps. The guy in the upper right here, the guy on that picture is a guy by the name of James Carr. Now, I don't believe he's related to me. He's a pretty awful guy, but he came up here from upstate New York. He worked as a lumberjack for maybe a season. He saw how much call there was for prostitution, and he wired back to Rochester, New York, to Maggie Duncan and said, will you come and run a brothel with me? They ran a brothel for several years. That at one point was the biggest taxpayer in Clare County. Now, even more so than the lumbering concerns, but the lumbering concerns were pretty good at keeping their property taxes to almost nothing, while the farmers were paying more foot in the bill, leading up to kind of a showdown, which ultimately affected James Carr because he was kind of in the pocket of the people who were in there now, who were backed by the lumbering concerns. But there were stories about him committing arson, burning down a competitor's house. People who went there and disappeared into the Devil's Ranch, which is what they called, what locals called his brothel. And It was even quite well known that there was a young woman by the name of Frankie Osborne who would come up from Saginaw after seeing an ad in the paper for something like a caretaker or clerical work or something. And she was working at his house, and she one night did not feel well. And so a customer asked her to dance, and she refused. And so he beat her in front of the customers. And a day or two later, beat her again for good measure, and she died in another woman's room in the house. They still couldn't get him though. So I'm going to read just a tiny bit from my second book. There was a guy, now they were trying to arrest him anytime they could for little things until they could get him on something big. So he was seeing the inside of a jail, but not for very long. One night he was sharing a jail cell with a guy by the name of Harold Jones, who the two of them were drinking whiskey right there in the cell. And he asked Mr. Jones if he would do him a favor for $500. Now, $500 went a long way. But what he wanted him to do was take a body in the ranch, burn the body, and then also shoot a particular deputy in the back. Well, he had done the one thing, he had burned the body. But one night he was at an inn where sharing a room with another passerby, another businessman up from Lowell, and he told the guy, he says, Lapham was his name, and he says that stove there could tell a pretty sad story. So Jones grabbed a lantern and led Lapham out for a dark tour. The snow was pretty much thawed off around the house, but there was still 8 or 10 inches in the woods. They came to the sandy clearing where Jones told them he had dug up the grave and removed the barrel. Lapham listened, staying alert and keeping his eyes on this man sharing the secrets he hadn't asked to hear. Jones then took him to a barn and showed him some steel hoops. They were, he explained, all that was left of the barrel that had acted as a crude casket. He told him how he removed the cover of the barrel and puked from the stench of the maggot-infested corpse. He chopped up the unknown man's bones so they'd fit in the stove and burned the body in the putrefied barrel staves, piece by piece. It took him the entire night, and now he wished he hadn't done it. What's more, he didn't plan to pull off the last part of the deal. Burning someone who was already dead was one thing, but killing someone, a lawman, was quite another. With the testimony of Mr. Jones, they finally had something to close down James Carr. And they put him away. They got Maggie Duncan, and operating in the House of Ill Repute, they put them both away. They were only away for a couple of years. They come back racked with addictions, and they died penniless in an unheated shack, thinking that they were going to make a comeback. But unfortunately, the lumbermen had moved on because the trees were gone there, and they moved a little bit further north. Now, I'm going to end on a story in the latest book again, Dark Side of the Mitten, and this is one that's on the Huron shoreline in Rogers City. And it's a little bit similar to the King of Beaver Island, which we've all heard. I think most of us have heard about, and I have covered somewhat in both of my earlier books. But this is more or less the Baron of Rogers City. It was a rocky, secluded place where they were starting to a lumber company. Now, Albert Molitor was an immigrant from Germany, and he was half owner of Rogers Molitor Company, but he was the on the site guy. He was there in the local operations while Rogers, the guy who the town's named after, was down in Detroit doing the financial stuff and helping to bankroll the whole business. It was an isolated lumber town. And Albert Molitor, this is him in his German military uniform. He, when he came over, he decided to basically be the Baron of the entire area. He was he was on the county government. He levied taxes for roads, which never got built. And the townspeople wanted their money back. And so they came out with a noose and their rifles and one morning and said to him, that we want our money or we're going to hang you. Well, he called their bluff. And there was a day-long standoff right out there in the hot sun until he ordered his dinner brought out. They had to stand there smelling it while he ate it, and they just said, "Oh, geez, that was about enough for them." But it wasn't enough because they hadn't given up. Molitor, he also offended everybody in town by putting the moves on the women. He was basically a Me Too candidate back in the 1880s. He was going after people's mothers, his employees' wives and daughters. One employee had a picture of his sister somewhere that he saw, and he said, "Who's that beautiful woman?" He says, "That's my sister back in Germany." He says, "Well, I will pay for her to come if you'd like to bring her over here and she can work for me." She came, she worked as personal assistant. She became pregnant with his infant very soon. He says, "Well, okay, we'll get married. We'll get married in Detroit." They got on a sleigh and they drove 250 miles south on a sleigh to Detroit, where they came to a street corner and he kicked her off the sleigh. He turned around and went back up to Rogers City. Well, she sued him successfully for $10,000 because she was pregnant with their child, but she never collected. He was Albert Molitor. He owed a lot of people money and he was never going to pay that. Well, people were fed up with his shenanigans. And one night, instead of a standoff and threats, they just came to his window while he was working on August night, kind of like just about twilight. And they shot through the windows. They shot him. He lingered for a while. They killed him and his assistant. Now, so many people in town had motives for killing him. It was like Murder on the Orient Express. So many people, there were several people involved in the shooting. That was obvious from the footprints, from all the shots and the bullets that came through the window and the different angles that they came from. And but nobody was turning anybody in, and it took them 11 years to get a scapegoat who finally felt guilty about something else, and they put him away for a while. But Albert, nobody that I know of mourned the loss of Albert Molitor. Well, that's where I'm ending it tonight, but I want to say that my books are for sale. I will answer questions in a moment, but I want to say that they're $16.95 each, or you can get all three for $45 if you contact me at thomasrobertcarr@gmail.com. If you want to take a look at my Facebook page, sometimes I post like an historical little blurbs up there. That's on Facebook. It's called Tom Carr Author. Anyway, but the $45 deal only is good through my through my website, although it is also available at local bookstores and on Amazon. I also know on books has carried some of my books in the past. So I thank you very much. And any questions that anybody has, I would love to answer them.
All right. Charlie, do you have anything that you want to ask?
Yeah, just how do you find out about these different stories? Some of them are kind of, the Dr. Beaumont, that's well-known figure. Some of these others are just really kind of hazy. How do you find out about them? How do you get started on that?
Well, I look for the best sources available. Sometimes I hear about them from people that come to these author events, and they'll tell me about something in their area or something like that. When I first started doing it, I kind of just made a list of some of the sensational ones that I had heard of or remembered firsthand from my lifetime, but also like Bath School Massacre. Well, saw that one morning when I went past a historical marker, and I thought, wow, I always read historical markers, but one about murdering 45 children is one that stuck with me. Most of them, they kind of I forget them right after I read them. But anyway, yeah, it's just everywhere. I looked at other, I like Googled lists. I looked up in the, almanacs of Michigan and Detroit and other, and so I asked people that I know that are familiar with different areas of the state. I says, well, what about your area? I've been, what am I missing in Flint? So there's always, there's so many different ways to get them. And I also spent a lot of time going through old newspapers on microfilm at the Library of Michigan in Lansing. And I hear that they're going to allow people back in pretty soon by appointment. So I hopefully to be down there pretty soon. But anyway, and also I have a subscription to newspapers.com, which has a lot of nowhere near the Michigan newspapers that they do at the state library. But anyway, anyway, so I guess asking around Google, it's hard, just so many and people just coming up to tell me. There's just a lot of different ways that I hear the stories. So.
Sure. So then, being in Marquette, I feel obligated to ask: did you ever do anything with Anatomy of a Murder with that story?
I did mention it. I didn't do it in a lot of depth. In my first book, I did it in Blood on the Mitten.
Oh, okay.
And I know that there's been a lot written on that. I just I also talked about. Well, anyway, I don't have a full chapter on it, but I do have a blurb about it in there. And I think it's next to a chapter about the guy who killed a conservation officer over in Nagani or Ispaming, and back in and the to get rid of the body, he dynamited the body, which didn't really help his case any. But so yeah. Anyway, so good question. Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, was there anyone? I mean, you obviously don't go out and like look for famous people and see if there's any kind of criminal connection with them. But was there any person that you came across that you were really surprised had like connection to, some kind of darker side? Yeah.
Well, I guess Chief Pontiac kind of did, and it's always easier for me to just flip through to I was doing the Kellogg's were kooky, and there was some people that I hadn't heard of, like some lumber barons who were kind of who had some colorful past, and so I have little chapters on them. As far as anybody, oh yes, the Dodge brothers. I didn't know anything about the Dodge brothers. When they were loved to drink and loved to fight, and you did not want to be around them when they had been drinking.
Mhm.
And Henry Ford and they had kind of a rivalry because they had been a subcontractor for him,
Mhm.
and on their own, he was really ticked off him. And it kind of, I know Henry Ford had a lot of prejudices, but the Dodge brothers both were redheads, and it kind of gave Henry Ford another prejudice. He held it against redheads,
Mm.
the bad dealings he'd had with the Dodge brothers, according to many people that were, you know, connected with them.
Mm. All right.
But that was one, yeah. And then like there was a guy that Cadillac left in charge, and he basically kicked or he beat a young Indian brave to death for kicking a dog, and
Wow.
that started an entire war between several tribes in the Detroit back then. So anyway, yeah, I wasn't so much surprised at the negativity behind any one person. Uh, but 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 I did learn a lot that I didn't know
Yeah.
when I was researching.
Yeah. Do you have one? I don't know if can you choose a favorite of all the ones that you've sort of investigated and written about? One that you found the most interesting?
Well, every time I try to do that, I'll say
Mm.
there's this one, but yeah, but there's this one, but that really, so it's kind of hard. But um, excuse me, I've had like at least a 30, probably 35-year fascination with the Italian Hall disaster ever since I
Mm.
first heard about it. That was one that has stuck with me, and it's led me to both. I mean, to go visit Calumet, and it's just, I mean, just it just kind of seems, I just kind of feel the aura, the ghosts of that era
Yeah.
there, and stuff. So, but yeah, that's one. Last
Yeah.
time I walked in.
Yeah, I
Um,
was just up in Calumet this weekend, and I mean, and I go up there frequently because I'm part of a show that they do, and that town really is, I think, haunted by that whole incident. It really is.
it seems
Um,
like it. Yeah, yeah. It's a
mhm,
fascinating place, but like I said, I love that. Um, so many beautiful towns up there. I'm also very fond of Marquette.
mhm, yeah,
Um,
mm,
but yeah, that Calumet has been one that has been kind of. But then of the ones that I didn't know of before I started writing books, um, one that there was a man who murdered his daughter and her friends in Detroit back in 1970
mm,
because she was living with a bunch of hippies, in a commune.
mm,
And that one has twists and turns, and I'm thinking about possibly turning that one into you know, expanding that one into a book.
mm,
Um, and then, um, and then James Carr, the brothel owner, too, is always
mm,
fascinating as
mm.
well. So
Well, it sounds like Michigan has plenty of material for you for you to use.
yeah, it does. It
Has
does. That's
has this,
interesting, and I love Michigan. You might think
yeah,
what's it?
No, yeah.
yeah, has this focus over the years changed your attitude about people or?
Um, Not so much. I mean, I think that it just has illustrated that people are the same in any era, in any
Yeah,
Mm,
location, because there's always horribleness, but most of us don't see it on a day-to-day basis,
yeah.
which makes it, all the more fascinating to read about, I think.
Mm,
But but yeah, no, it hasn't really changed my view on people. It just points out that, well, if you think that people are terrible today, I can tell you some pretty awful things that happened
sure,
200 years ago or whatever.
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
And people are wonderful too, so.
Absolutely, and most of them are, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Wow. Well, I really want to thank you, Tom, and thank you, Charlie, for coming.
Yes, thank you both, and I enjoyed it, and I'm sorry I was kind of, well, I hope my delivery was okay. And
it
Um,
was
This is
great.
great.
It was
Yep, it's fine.
it was really fascinating. And what I'm gonna do, Tom, is I'm gonna put your email up when I post this video so that people can contact you for your books. And then I'm also gonna contact Hans and Kurt at the public radio station, and I'll get you an interview with them, connect you so that you can talk with them, because I know that there's tons of people around this area that are going to love getting your book and reading it, because I just finished it. I took it to Calumet with me this weekend and
Oh,
read it
excellent,
at
excellent.
Calumet. So,
Which one,
so,
Dark Side or?
the dark side. Yep, I brought the dark side with me. Yep.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Cool,
so it
okay.
was sort of a really great, it was a great place to read the book and just sort of enjoy that. And, you know, like I said, in a town that is sort of haunted by a tragedy. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. All right. Well,
Well, thank you so much, and, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I was just gonna thank you again, Tom. This was really, really wonderful. And like I said, when this whole pandemic thing finally calms down enough, we got to get you up here for an in-person event. So
Please.
that at the library. So
Excellent. Yes, I'm looking forward to it.
awesome. And thank you too, Charlie,
Yep,
for
thanks very much.
coming
Thank you.
tonight.
Have a great night.
All
Yep.
right. See you guys later. Bye-bye.
Night.
Thank you, Tom. That went really well. So
Okay, yeah, well, thank you guys. I'm trying to get, yeah.
I'll end the meeting. Don't worry. I'll end the meeting for all here. So here we go. And
Okay, well, just,
like
yeah,
I
just
said,
keep me posted on the NPR and stuff, and give them
Yeah.
my address and whatever.
I will do that, and we'll get you connected with them, because I think that Hans and Kurt would love to talk to you. So, okay.
Appreciate it. All
All
right.
right. Have a good
Thanks,
evening, Tom.
Bobby. You
All
too.
right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.